risk-on investors who are already space smart, already interested, are going to be pulling out, on the order to $20 to $30 billion per year for the next 5 years. And are they going to reinvest that in space? Or are they going to go somewhere else that might appear more attractive just because of the way the government has, jury-rigged the incentives?
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. As we start the fourth week of Operation Epic Fury, attention is squarely on how the United States plans to secure the Strait of Hormuz to lower gasoline, diesel, and natural gas prices, not just for Americans, but pretty much everyone on the planet. And while that work continues, this time of year, every year, from March through April, various groups make a pilgrimage to Capitol Hill for advocacy season. They battle for ears, for attention. Just this week, the National Business Aviation Association, the American Coalition for Ethanol, the American Library Association, and others held advocacy training days and then started knocking on the doors of senators and representatives. The Alliance for Space Development, or ASD or ASD, organized the 30th annual space advocacy event. It's called March Storm. The alliance includes names you'd recognize, like the National Space Society, the Frontier Foundation, the Mars Society, Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, and others. We've got Peter Garretson, who you may know as a space power advocate and a regular on this podcast, and Aaron Oesterle. He's the Space Foundation's policy director. They're going to explain just what's at the top of the space legislative agenda and why what they're asking for from Congress will strengthen national security and support future commercial and defense operations from the Kármán line to the moon and beyond. And better yet, why Congress needs to act now. But first, a message from this week's episode sponsor, L3 Harris. L3 Harris is the trusted disruptor in defense tech with customers' mission-critical needs always in mind. L3 Harris delivers end-to-end technology solutions connecting the space, air, land, sea, and cyber domains in the interest of national security. Learn more at l3harris.com. Now here's my conversation with Peter and Aaron. Hello, and welcome back, Peter.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's wonderful to be back.
And Aaron, welcome to the Downlink podcast. This is your first time.
Indeed it is, Laura. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So you two have been super busy this week, and what you've been up to is the reason why I have you both on the podcast for this episode. But before we get into that, please take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience. And Peter, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you, Laura. My name is Peter Garretson. I'm a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council and the author of several books on space.
And your most recent book, come on.
The most recent book is Space Shock, which is about 18 scenarios that are bound to surprise America, but they're coming.
Thank you. And everyone, you really should go out and get the book. And Aaron, tell us what you do and where you do it.
Sure, Laura. So my name is Aaron Oesterle, and I'm the policy director for the Space Frontier Foundation. I've done space policy work now for about 15 years. I'm a recovering engineer because I was going to be an aerospace engineer, but I found I was really bad at the physics, and that's how I got into the policy world.
Well, on Monday, you, and I don't know what Peter was doing there, but I'm sure Peter had a role that he's going to explain. But Aaron, you held a training session on Monday before sending roughly 50 people to the Hill on Tuesday and Wednesday, right? And first of all, what were you guys doing? Why is this even necessary? I'm sure that legislators understand the importance of supporting the commercial space ecosystem. And why it also matters for defense, or or what did you guys have to go there just to remind them of this?
So the short version is you have to remember that Congress is a multifaceted body. Think of it as the Mall of America, and all the good and
A
all the bad.
Marvel Mall of America.
Yes, a literal Mall of America, and with all the good and all the bad that that brings with it. I have met members and staffers who run rings around me in terms of knowledge and intelligence and that kind of thing. And then I've met others who don't. And in their defense, they're facing a whole range of issues: the war in Iran, the budget when that's going to be released, various internal issues. Right now, there's the DHS. Mark Wayne Mullen has been nominated to take over DHS, and they're holding hearings on that. And it's all over the map, and it will be on a range of issues. Everybody will focus on like one or two big issues within their purview, but the reality is Congress focuses on so many issues, and people are running around and they're trying to, on AI and quantum and this and that. And so you have to engage with Congress, we've found, if you want to get them to listen to you. It's like any place else. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. So if they don't hear from you, nothing happens. So we make certain they hear from us.
Peter, why is training though for this necessary? I shouldn't these people be able to go up and be able to just sort of walk through the door, or maybe there's a real
Well, Laura,
misconception there.
well, you've got to understand that March Storm, which is the largest and most consequential mobilization of space advocates, are volunteers of all ages. Some coming from as young as high school, some coming from university space policy clubs, halfway around the country, some coming locally, right? Other people coming, from various backgrounds, and most of these folks are advocates. They're not full time, they're not Hill lobbyists, right? And some of them have never been in Washington D.C. Some of them have never interacted with congressional staff, and they're coming in a private capacity, but they're coming to carry a unified message. And so, all of us, regardless of what our individual takes on the thing, when we volunteer to be part of March Storm, we are supporting the March Storm consensus message, which is the message that's been negotiated by quite a number of supported organizations. That includes the Space Frontier Foundation, that has decades of successful policy engagement. That includes the National Space Society, that's the largest mobilized membership grassroots organization. It includes the Space Force Association. It includes just a bunch that Aaron may want to talk about. But the point is, everybody's coming with a limited information set, and then they are all supposed to be broadcasting and working together, and they need to understand, how do you interact with staff, how do you interact with members, what are they likely to care about, how are you going to triage and discuss it, what's the structure of a good meeting. And so we want to equip these volunteers so that that's going to be a successful engagement. And we want to make sure that they understand the message, in sufficient detail, that they can go forward and answer the questions that the staffers are likely to have. And so that honestly requires a day-long engagement in order to make sure that the volunteers are set up for success.
If I can jump in here, Laura, real quick. One key part of our training is we have a former staffer who comes in and says, this is how you have a successful interaction. And she walks through the meetings. And one of the things like she'll point out, your meeting starts the moment you get on Capitol Hill, because you have to be nice to everybody, because you never know who you'll see.
You may be bumping into on your way into the office, or cutting in front of in the line.
Exactly.
That's a very important point. Now, that you have had your conversations with staffers and members, I want to know what surprised you. Was there a moment or a reaction or a piece of feedback that really stuck with you from the past 2 days?
So I would say I was surprised by some of the receptivity to one of our proposals. I was hopeful, but I was surprised at the level of optimism that came with that proposal. For those who haven't seen the proposals, one of our proposals is we need to have kind of a connective tissue that tells the story of what we're doing in space. Because you've got companies that are looking at space stations and companies that are looking at launch, and they've got companies that are looking at Earth observation and so on and so forth, all these various things, but nothing that says kind of how we're doing this and why we're doing this. And one of our proposals is to literally have in a commercial space bill language that says we see the U.S. government sees space as a major area for economic and sociological development. I don't remember the exact words, but something like that. And then it lists out a series of activities and capabilities and things we want to see happen in the next 50 years. And nobody's done that because we have things like NASA's Moon to Mars program and stuff like that, but it's not connected with the whole space ecosystem. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed seeing that's a great idea from staffers.
Wow. Well, I have to say that, yeah, and I'm looking from the outside, obviously, that it hasn't really occurred or been done yet, right? Because, I mean, we are always talking about space and its connectivity, that it's a cross-cutting issue. And I think the thing that surprises me by what you said is that that's not being talked about, that's not really apparent, and that is actually missing, isn't it? From policy. Like, we don't really have a whole of government or a whole of nation sort of effort here. And I know that, this is something that Peter and I have spoken about quite often. But yeah, the lack of a North Star even, right?
Yeah.
So, because it all kind of comes from that. But hey, one of your primary asks, because I have read the documents that you thankfully shared, 3 of them, yes. And one of them is about, pieces of legislation, things that need to change. And one of your primary asks is for Congress to formally declare commercial space development a national policy. Right. And for listeners who aren't on the Hill, why does a declaration like that matter? How does a line in legislation actually change behavior, especially for investors, sitting on $50 to $80 billion in IPO proceeds, aka dry powder, as George Poland would call it? But yeah, why does this matter? Why should they listen, and why should this happen?
Well, what we have found, to bring it back to the dry powder thing that you just mentioned, literally, that's where we started with this year's agenda. We said, in essence, how do we that $60 to $80 billion? How do we make certain that stays in the space industry and doesn't just get taken out or invested in other industries?
AI, right? I mean, AI is sucking up all of like 80% of VC money right now.
And what we hear from investors and the public, and to a certain degree China as well, we don't hear it from China, but we see this with China, I should say, is China and others present these big pictures, and they want to know that the government, the investors and business people and companies, they want to know that the U.S. government sees the value of large-scale space development, not just a mission here or there, but a market where there's room for 5 different space stations, room for a giant lunar base, all those and all the infrastructure that comes with that. And so what we wanted is that's part of our requirement is to have the government say, this is important and we see it as important, and that will drive behavior. I'll give a good example from my friend Taylor. She's the former staffer who comes in and helps us do our training. She wanted there to be a national laboratory in space permanently, and she helped arrange the language and so on and so forth. And she knows from later discussions that there were companies that came about just because that language existed in a bill. That bill never made it into law, but just the fact that there was language in a bill that said there will be a national lab in space, it happened, and companies were formed by that. And that's the same thing that'll happen here. Is opportunities will present themselves. Companies will, people will come down and say, hey, I have this widget that can deliver whatever it is. It can mine the moon at much reduced costs or whatever. And it can help us get critical minerals, all those kinds of things. And by saying, as a policy declaration, we're going to develop space, it makes it clear that the U.S. government is investing in space for the long term.
And a couple points to amplify that, Laura. One is that even in a democracy, there's a hierarchy, and policy, creates a weather vane effect. And so, once something is established, in written policy, and laws, the most powerful of that, you know, people turn and look at that and they reference that. And in the private sector, investors who look at potential space ideas, and they don't want to get ahead of where they think the government and the regulation wants people to be. So if they haven't explicitly said it, they're worried that, well, maybe they don't want us to do that. And so they may be hesitant. And so just having a positive expression of, these are what we think are in America's interest, and this is what we'd like to see commercial space develop, that's a big deal. And you can see how big a policy change can be. Just this week, we see the effects of the December executive order that talked about cislunar. And in the last 2 days, we've seen the acting SAF SQ, Mr. Ainsworth, talk about the need for Space Force to get cislunar capabilities, and then to see the CSO, General Saltzman, also have very similar language. So bills like this could be very powerful, and it's important. One of the things we didn't start out by saying is how successful Mark Storm and these membership-based organizations have been in the past. So there would really be no, commercial orbital space transportation system, to the ISS, and therefore SpaceX. There wouldn't be any commercial crew, and therefore Dragon, had it not been for these grassroots efforts going to the Hill to try to move that when those seemed like impossible things, right? And so, this year, these same organizations are trying to create the next level of enabling policy guidance to give the United States the next level of commercial access and growing the economy and radically increasing the number of folks who can participate in space.
And speaking about participating in space and growing the commercial sector, you guys identified a long list of places where existing federal incentives are, right? Like things like small business investment company financing, the qualified small business stock exemption, and depreciation rules. They simply weren't written with space companies in mind, which is understandable because they probably try to capture as many different kinds of sectors under that umbrella, but it doesn't really fit the mechanics of space investing, technology development, and therefore the exits for venture capitalists, right? Because it's a time thing. Everyone, looks at investing of a 3 to 5 year, investment to exit. When in space, it's really, you're not going to get out before 7. So, and that's if you're lucky, but it's really more like 10. So it's not really written for the space sector and for, real
and
hard technology development. But walk us through a concrete example, like what is an SBIC, right? Which is a small business investment company. Why does this matter for a space startup, and what specifically needs to change in the law to fix it?
All right. So why this matters. You have a plethora of startup companies that are very small. They may have a few 20-something employees, and on every measure, this is a small business. They are not, a Lockheed Martin, and they shouldn't be treated, like a Lockheed Martin. But let's face it, that, you cannot develop space technology on the kind of budget that's typically thought of as a small business. So even though, they might have large returns to sell a single satellite, they've got unbelievably large, initial outlays and, recurring outlays. And so this causes them to be treated in ways that are definitely not preferential or appropriate for a small business. And so one of the things you could do is to update, in this case, 13 CFR 121.104, such that certain technology sectors like space that have very high initial and recurring R&D costs, would be treated specially and would still be able to be listed as a small business. And that could be, extremely valuable because there's an entire infrastructure, an entire agency to help small businesses that the space industry just gets priced out of because of the high, R&D and entry costs. And so that's one big deal. The other one is like, what qualifies small business, for capital gains, exemption for early stage investors. So, there again, there's a 26 US code, 1202 that could be amended to allow for higher gross asset limits. And sort of across the board in this deliverable is we have a broad range of congressionally given authorities, that relate to taxes and qualification and a range of very small things that other businesses can take advantage of, but they don't specifically say and space. For example, we have advanced manufacturing, but space isn't necessarily considered to be advanced manufacturing. We have the ability to depreciate 5-year assets in some sectors, but that doesn't apply to, say, spacecraft. And so, what this does is it makes space a less investable sector. And the reason why this is on this year's agenda, because every year it's slightly different what the asks are to Congress in March storm, is because the expectation that the investors who for 10, 15 years have had their investment capital locked up in SpaceX, when SpaceX goes public, the anticipation is that those risk-on investors who are already space smart, already interested, are going to be pulling out, on the order to $20 to $30 billion per year for the next 5 years. And are they going to reinvest that in space? Or are they going to go somewhere else that might appear more attractive just because of the way the government has, jury-rigged the incentives? And so, in order to maximize our chance to compete and have U.S. leadership, this is the time to fix these little things. Now, the difficult thing is that these authorities that affect space are not in the congressional jurisdiction of the Space, Science, and Commerce committees. They're in small business. They're in, taxation. In some cases,
Yeah, this is tax law that
they're
you're
in
talking
different
about
places,
a lot.
right?
Yeah.
And, the difficulty in the way, Congress is set up is that they typically are averse to getting in each other's lanes. And, it's a remarkably big ask, even to ask the Space Science Committee to lead that discussion with the other folks. And so that was a major effort to try to sensitize folks on each side of this to say, these are things that we think that at the macro level can accelerate the commercial space economy. But that gets into kind of the other thing that we already talked about in the first one, which is it's a major educational hurdle when you talk to not just most congressmen, but most Americans, is that in the minds of most Americans, they see space as synonymous with NASA. And the whole idea that there is a separate and important policy specifically for commercial space, and that commercial space could be playing this increasing a very important role for the United States, and it is a big deal. Even getting people to look at space in the context of economic development as opposed to just science or glory, it is a very significant uphill educational project that has taken March Storm and its membership organizations decades just to get us to where we are today.
Sticking on the commercial side of this, right? That space isn't just NASA, and it's not just Space Force, but that this really does depend a lot now, especially now, on the commercial sector. You guys are pushing hard for a commercially led lunar base, and you are explicitly warning against what you call, quote, ISS on the moon. And ISS is the International Space Station, right? Which is a consortium of nations that have launched different modules, put them together. And that's why it's very, government heavy, I guess you could say. And
Yep.
it served its purpose. It's done some amazing things, and it is multinational, and it's a good paradigm, I would say, to jump off from. But it has its limitations, and the world has changed, right? So you call this warning as ISS on the moon. You explain that it's like a trap. Could you sort of give us an explanation why, and make the case for why the lunar base must be commercial from day one, rather than trying to get the commercial sector involved later, right? Like
Sure.
we've done with the ISS, and just so everyone understands, yes, the commercial sector is now involved with the International Space Station. Like NanoRacks has space on the space station for experiments, and there's a whole, we've got tourists that have gone to the space station. That's a whole private activity. But you guys say that it needs to be a commercial activity on the moon. from the point go. So why?
Two reasons, I would say. The first reason is very simple. Transitions suck. We've done the thing of going from shuttle to commercial launch. That was very painful, very painful. Because we didn't even know if you could legally launch rockets by a private sector at the time they were talking about it. So that was horribly painful. And then there was commercial crew. That was also very painful. There was a lot of people who said, "Oh, you can't trust commercial to do human launch," and that's proven not to be true. But the transition was horrible. It was. I mean, it wasn't horrible, but it was very hard. It was very hard. And now we're going through transition to commercial space stations, and that's proving hard. And so, from that standpoint, does it make sense to repeat the mistakes of the past? No. The other side of this coin is that we want to go back to the moon for is economic development. If you want to do economic development, you got to have the commercial sector involved in the first place. So if a company wants, like Interloon, they want to mine for helium-3 for quantum, they should be able to plug right into the lunar base and be part of it to do their thing. Those kind of things should be able to plug right in and be part of the lunar campus. Now, it's going to be tricky to get it just right, but if you're literally looking at just recreating the ISS on the moon, it's just government dictating everything. It costs government everything. If you can spread that cost around, that's also an additional benefit. But the key thing is, if we're going to do economic development, you got to put commercial in from the get-go, and this way you avoid the painful transitions. So
Peter?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I've got a lot to say about this.
I know you do, and that's why I'm coming to you, because the thing is that there are going to be a lot of folks out there saying, "Well, wait a minute, what do you mean develop commercial on the moon? I thought, the moon, we're just going to set up a place, we're going to man it every once in a while, and then we're going to, go to Mars," right? That this is a NASA-led thing. This is Artemis Accords. This is all that. So yeah, speak your truth, Peter.
Well, again, this comes back to sort of the basic education of people associating space with NASA, and sort of the gap, I think, in understanding that seemed apparent to me between the current thinking on the Hill versus the thinking in the administration. So, what was very different about SPD-1 and the National Space Policy, is that the purpose, the fundamental purpose of going to the moon isn't to set up a science station. It isn't to set up, Edmondson Station or, the ISS on the moon. It is to enable large-scale use and manufacturing of the resources with commercial, right? That's the national purpose. And so how you can do that without inherently thinking about what that looks like. And yes, it's NASA-led, but there are two entirely different mental models of what NASA-led means. If you talk to many legacy folks at NASA and on the Hill, their idea is, well, NASA's going to do it first, and they're going to test out the technology, and then, commercial can come behind, or commercial means that there will be resupply of essentially the NASA science mission and the support of the astronauts. And so, in kind of the parlance of like the Department of Defense, in the supporting relationship, NASA is the supported command and commercial is the supporting, right? But that's not how any of us in this community understand the intent of the White House, which understands it in exactly the opposite, that NASA is in the supporting relationship and commercial is in the supported, right? And in that, the relationship should look more like a port authority. It should look, it's less things plugging into NASA as the NASA moon base, like a USB hub that is supporting multiple different manufacturing efforts. And that is also important because understanding the race we are in with China, they're building their lunar plan to develop a $10 trillion moon Earth economic zone and do manufacturing on the moon and make use of its multiple energy sources. And, they want to have, initially megawatts of nuclear power to build gigawatts of solar power. And we're not in that game. And so what we think is, you don't want to have something where you take one step forward and create something like ISS that's not meant to be plugged into, and where the posture of the chief tenant may be risk averse to anything else that might be there. and it ends up being a GDP negative, right? So it's a cost to America, as opposed to something that's an investment that is GDP positive, that's building the industries and manufacturing of the future explicitly as its mission, not a mission to support 3 astronauts who take rock samples, but a mission of a moon base that supplies the communication, the precision navigation and timing, the surveys that lower the cost and risk for the commercial tenants, as a mall developer might be, to move forward. And if that governance structure and that mentality isn't there from the start, the taxpayers are just wasting their dollars, and the administration is not going to get what it's asked for in terms of massive use and the future of industrial development. So we think that this is like super important, that from the very beginning, when you're starting to think about everything related to the architecture, the purpose, commercial has to be baked in. It can't be like, oh, and now 10 years later, we don't want to do a moon base anymore, so who wants to take over and operate it? Oh, but it's not designed for that, so I guess we'll just have to have commercial lunar destinations and start off with new lunar bases, and we've wasted 1 to 2 decades.
Now, speaking of lunar energy, and I have to tell you guys that we have gone overtime right now, so we need to be really efficient now. But I want to jump on what you said about energy, right? That China has plans for energy on the moon, and that, the discussions about how we're going to develop energy on the moon are kind of, nascent. Let's just be honest. I know that there's a lot of really good work coming out of Johns Hopkins University at the Applied Research Laboratory and their consortium. So I don't want to, forget that work really is happening, but not at a national level, which kind of goes to what you're asking from Congress, which is to fund the Space Force's Office of Operational Energy at $100 million a year, right? And it's an office that exists on paper, but has allegedly never received a dollar. I have to say that I was actually taken aback when I read your claim that it is not funded at all, and that the other service branches not only have this office, but those offices are funded, right? So what are the implications of that lack of funding? I mean, that lack of policy or programming. I see it as kind of a planning and logistics issue. And, you win wars on logistics, and you can't do logistics unless you have energy, whatever domain you're in. So what should this office do? Why isn't it funded? And what's the scene here? Like, I'm kind of shocked.
So the part
shocked,
of
I say.
part is you have to. I mean, we have to be respectful. The Space Force is the youngest branch, and so they're still working through all the implications of that. But every branch is required to have an operational energy office, and they've never stood up an office until now. They stood it up for, I want to say, 2 to 3 months. There's a half a person working there, and
I've lived that dream. Not good.
No, and as you say, logistics is how you win wars, and energy is a key part of logistics. And there's companies that want to do beamed power. There's companies that want to do space nuclear power, all that kind of thing for a whole host of things. And there's R&D work that needs to be done for these things. And so we said, we want to see things like space solar power happen. We want to see space nuclear power happen, and the Space Force is inherently a good place to start with this stuff. And so given that in 2023, there was $2.8 billion for operational energy, we don't think $100 million for this year is that much. And that's in 2023 dollars. Forget what it was last year. But so we think there's ample room for this in the president's budget.
Yeah, Laura.
I can't believe that you have nothing to say, Peter.
No. And curiously, I have literally absolutely nothing to do with formulating, this. But I'm so happy that ASD arrived at this, because let's talk about why this is structurally such an important innovation. So, I personally witnessed, when I was, still working for the government, multiple structural failures, because the incentives always default technology development and technology needs to things that can essentially be delivered, in like a 3 to 4 year period. And so things like space nuclear power, or, space-based solar power beaming, next generation solar cells and manufacturing, right? these things tend to not show up and stay on the tech needs statement because, or megawatt class levels of power, because they're too ambitious and they don't have a headquarters level sponsor who controls the money.
They don't have a
So
sugar daddy.
Yeah, they don't have a sugar daddy, or their sugar daddy in Congress will send, $100 million 1 year to develop space nuclear power, and it never gets, as they say, budgeted for. And so it doesn't stay in transition, right? So having a literal office with the power of the purse means continuity, it means advocacy, and for Congress, it means oversight. That, hey, and for organizations like ours that want to track things related to space development, it lets us know how much are we spending, should we be asking for an increase, and to be able to push for things that that have broad impact. And it's important to realize that every dollar that the Department of War or Department of Defense or Space Force spends on energy technology, which is what this fund is. And by the way, it lets them do matching funds, sometimes with a really high ratio of like 3-to-1 or something with the OSD funds. So the other Army and Air Force can compete in that. Harder for the Space Force without money in their operational energy to compete for that.
Harder unless they have like a real office that's actually really staffed with a full-time staffer. I mean,
and money,
right? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But now, you've got the potential of an office that sees itself as the protector of and creator of these long-term capabilities that are broadly enabling. And if you're developing, radioisotope generators or space nuclear power or next generation photovoltaics or better batteries or power amplifiers, beamed energy, all those things, right, are inherently dual use. They are going to proliferate, to help NASA. They are going to proliferate to help the commercial sector. And power and energy is the foundation of space economic development and national advantage. And if you want to have a successful Golden Dome, or you want to have successful in-space data centers, or you want to have successful Mars transfer, all depends on power. And so it's hard to think of a better long-term investment than having an office who thinks it's their job, and they're at the apex of the headquarters system that can decide, does that money go to AFRL or Naval Research Lab or one of the various universities or companies. It just seems like it's a very powerful structural innovation to put the Space Force on the right path long-term for national advantage.
So, gents, we've really run out of time. So this is a quick answer. Can be one word, can be one sentence, but not more. Was the trip to the Hill a success? Aaron?
Absolutely. Please join us next year.
And how can people do that?
Look up the Alliance for Space Development online, or Space Frontier Foundation, or National Space Society, and you can join. It's not that hard.
And it's in March, hence the name March Storm.
Peter, Aaron, thank you both so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.